guys, and we can get started. Okay, thank you everybody for coming today. We're really excited to be doing all these seminar series since we're all, in our own private environments nowadays. But I would like to introduce Nasha Ely and Linda Watson from the Department of Labor and Opportunity, and they're going to be talking to you today about reasonable accommodations in the workplace. So first of all, thank you ladies for joining us. We're very honored to have both of you here talking to all of us.
Well, thank you for having us. And we actually have someone else with us that I will introduce in a second. My name is Nasha Ely, and we thank you for joining us for today's training. This is the year of celebration for the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and VR, vocational rehabilitation. Every state in all US territories have a designated vocational rehabilitation agency. And here in Michigan, MRS is the designated agency. Michigan Rehabilitation Services embraces Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act and works tirelessly to ensure fair access and a level playing field within the workplace. The ADA was enacted in 1990 and amended in 2008 and is divided into 5 titles. Employment is Title I, and this will be our focus today. Title II is Public Services. Title III is Public Accommodations. Title IV, Telecommunications, and Title V, Miscellaneous. So Title I, Employment, is for individuals with disabilities. As I said, I'm Nasha Ely. I'm a business relations consultant from MRS, and I'm joined by 2 of my colleagues who will introduce themselves.
Well, good morning. My name is Linda Watson. I am also a business relations consultant with Michigan Rehabilitation Services. And because I'm sharing my screen, I can't figure out how to mute myself or turn my camera on. So we got to love these technology snafus, but hopefully you can hear my voice and you can paint your own picture of what I look like.
Well, Linda is just as lovely as she sounds. I can vouch for that. I'm Angela Blanchard. I'm an occupational therapist with MRS Business Network Division, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, so during this presentation, we've already experienced a little bit of a technology snafu, but we always go over these housekeeping tips during our presentations, especially now that all of us are virtual. So here are some tips for you guys as we progress through this training. We want you to exercise patience, especially with technology. Mute your microphones and please keep your video feature turned off. It helps to maximize the quality of the presentation, actually. This is your training. It's truly intended to be interactive. Please use the chat feature for your questions, your comments throughout the training. Our team will definitely respond directly back to you in the chat, and we will have a Q&A section at the end of the training. If time doesn't allow us to answer all your questions or comments, we will absolutely provide follow-up directly to you after the training. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Nasha.
Thanks, Linda. So as I mentioned, under Title I of the ADA, this is all about employment for individuals with disabilities. Under Title I, adjustments to the job application process can be made so a qualified applicant with a disability can be considered for a position. Modifications to a physical work environment or to the way a job is usually performed can also be an accommodation. And this is so the individual with the disability can perform the essential functions of that position. And changes that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment like those enjoyed by other employees without disabilities should also be considered and made. This can include things like access to cafeterias, access to lounges, auditoriums, and if there is company provided transportation, it should also be accessible to meet the needs of individuals who are employed with the organization with disabilities. So we've said reasonable accommodation and accommodations a lot just in a couple of minutes, but what is this really and does it apply to you? According to the Department of Labor, A job accommodation is an adjustment to a job or a work environment. These adjustments make it possible for individuals with a disability to perform their job duties. Accommodations can include specialized equipment. It can include modifications to the work environment or the work itself. It can also be changes in work schedules or job responsibilities. Not all accommodations are going to look the same for individuals. So even people who are working to have the exact same diagnosis may not need the same accommodation. All accommodations should be individualized and should meet the need of the specific person requesting it. It should not be a blanket approach that everyone that has X diagnosis or X disability gets the same accommodation just because the disability is the same. So now that we've discussed what a reasonable accommodation is, Linda's going to talk about what an unreasonable accommodation may look like.
Thanks, Nasha. And while you were talking, I figured out how to start my video. So hi, everyone, this is me. I'm going to cut my video off to keep our quality of our PowerPoint top notch. Okay, so what is an unreasonable accommodation? Well, first and foremost, an individual must ask for the accommodation in order for an employer to grant the accommodation. They need to start what we call the interactive process. And it's not just what we call the interactive process, it's what the ADA refers to as the interactive process. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail as we progress through the training to give you guys really a rich understanding of what that is. Because when we talk about accommodations, the interactive process is really the meat and potatoes of that. So once that request is made, the employer must engage in that interactive process. When more than one accommodation would work, an employer may choose the one that is less costly or that's easier to provide. So an unreasonable accommodation would be if you had someone who wanted the Cadillac version when the Yugo version, maybe I'm dating myself, a Pinto, still dating myself, an Escort. Well, you guys get the point. A less costly car version of an accommodation. If that will do, then someone making a demand for a higher cost accommodation would be considered unreasonable. Does that mean you don't have to do the accommodation altogether? Absolutely not. It means that as the employer, you have the option to select one that is more costly as long as it meets the needs of the individual. So an accommodation that imposes an undue hardship on business operation would also be an unreasonable accommodation. An employer is required to make a reasonable accommodation to the known disability of a qualified applicant or an employee, as long as it doesn't impose that undue hardship on operation need. There's several ways we can look at this. And really, one way that we can help to you guys to understand truly what that would look like is if you had a receptionist who their job was to open the office, be that front desk person, and really interact with customers on a daily basis, face-to-face. And one of their reasonable accommodation requests was that they're able to work from home. Really big popular topic right now. Unfortunately, that would be an undue hardship because that receptionist, their job is to meet and be that front-facing person in that office. So that's something that would likely not be able to be accommodated with that particular accommodation. Again, does that mean you don't do an accommodation at all? No, you just have to kind of think outside the box and what's going on at the heart of the issue here and how do we accommodate that in a way that it is both helpful to the employee and will be within business operation needs. Also, it's really important to remember that you as the business are not required to lower the quality or production standards to make an accommodation. So let's just say that you're a manufacturing business and you have someone needs to put together widgets and they need to do 10 widgets an hour and they're unable to meet that production standard because of their disability. If you can put an accommodation in to help them meet that production standard, that would be a reasonable accommodation. But if they were asking to only make 5 widgets in an hour, If that goes against business need, that could potentially be considered unreasonable. Nasha, I know you wanted to add something to this.
Yes, I did. So as we're speaking about reasonable accommodations, keep in mind that there are actually kind of two protections that might cover an individual. An individual who has 15 or more employees has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But what if you don't? What if you only have 6 or 7 employees? I'm so sorry. An individual with a disability is still protected under the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act of 1976. So in Michigan, this is a very specific act to cover an individual with a disability that works for an employer that has between 1 and 14 employees. I just wanted to clarify that just a little bit. And if you have questions or comments throughout this training, please utilize the chat. And we also have a Q&A at the end, but if anything comes up, just let us know and we can answer as we're going through the training.
Thanks so much for that, Nasha. Yeah, that's very good and important to remember because we know we work with a lot of smaller businesses in the state of Michigan, and perhaps you're from a smaller business on the line. Typically, folks think 15 or more employees, I need to comply with the reasonable accommodation. However, as Nasha just shared, that's not exactly the truth. But it really does behoove an organization, a business, to work with the current staff that they have to try to accommodate them in the ways in which they can. And just some fun facts for you guys. Most accommodations cost absolutely nothing. And for an accommodation that does come at a cost, it's usually $500 or less. And there are a ton of agencies out there, including the agency that we represent, that can partner with you to help ease that financial burden as well. So remember that as you think about implementing reasonable accommodations. So let's talk about this in kind of a little bit of a 5-step process here. The first thing is the request comes in. Now, that initiates what we call the interactive process. And again, the next slide, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it doesn't necessarily need to look like what you may think. You're not going to have employee A coming up to you as HR or management or business owner saying, my name is such and such, I have such and such, and I need a reasonable accommodation. May not look like that. You may start noticing this person is having difficulties on their shift, meeting their quota, performing their job. You also know that this person has been out with sick leave, or that they regularly attend appointments, or that they have what we would call a visible disability that makes it very difficult for them to do the job that they're doing. And they start talking to you about these problems. They think they might need a little extra help. That could be the request that initiates the interactive process. Again, there's no standard language that says we are now beginning the interactive process. You too, as an employer, can approach an individual and say, I notice that you've been having difficulties with XYZ on your job. Is there anything we can do to help you improve your performance or to do your job better? That's a pretty standard question or something around there that allows you to open the door and invite the conversation where this person may request a reasonable accommodation. That in no way violates their privacy because you haven't come to them and said something like, I know that you've been in a car accident and you're having difficulty standing on the job for 8 hours. Be careful with the language that you use. I encourage you just to use kind of standard HR language. We've noticed you've experienced difficulties meeting your quota, doing your job. Is there anything we can do to assist to help you be a better employee? That's good enough. And then move on. That invites that person to engage in that process with you. Once that person does engage in that process, it does initiate that interactive process with you. At that point, if the disability is not obvious, and if you need documentation to verify this, it's very important that you understand that, because if it's an obvious disability, let's say someone uses a prosthetic device and they request a prosthetic arm and they're requesting some sort of accommodation for handling packages or material, you can visibly see that that person has a disability. Under the ADA, you do not need to request documentation for that. And if you do that, and you hold that person off from implementing a reasonable accommodation, you are violating their rights. So you can request diagnostic information when it's not visible or readily apparent that you understand what that disability is. and also to help you understand possibly how to accommodate that individual. Once you have that documentation or you're aware of that physical disability and you understand the needs associated with that, you move on to what we call assessing the accommodation options. And this is really important, that interactive process. You're going to collaborate and communicate with, first and foremost, the person themselves, the employee that has the disability. And that is truly at the heart of the interactive process. You're going to work together because that person is the biggest expert on themselves and really lets you know who they are, what they've done in the past, what they're having difficulties with, and what they think might be helpful to them. During this process, you can also consult with an outside agency. So that, again, would be someone like us. If you don't know how to accommodate someone or you're looking for additional information, we can definitely be there for you to walk you through that process. Once you think that you found an appropriate accommodation, really you're going to select which accommodation and put that into place. And I know it says with or without timeframes, but it becomes really important here if you're going to put an accommodation in place, set a time in which you're going to review that documentation and that accommodation. So that would look like this next step. You're going to measure its effectiveness, follow up. Is this working for you? Are you able to meet the needs that we need you to do? Are you able to perform those essential functions of this position with this accommodation? Here's where something comes into play that I have seen many businesses do and kind of get their tail caught in the door, for lack of a better way to say that. If at this point in this process, if that accommodation has not worked, you are still obligated to resume this process. If that accommodation doesn't work, we talk about trial and error. You try a different accommodation. You keep trying till something works. No, it's not an open-ended date, but if you have tried all the reasonable accommodations at your fingertips and it still won't work, then you can talk about possibly a job modification, which is also actually a reasonable accommodation that we'll talk about later. Or you could talk about transitioning someone to a different job or transitioning them out of employment. This is very sticky in this area, but we highly encourage you. Under the ADA, you are guided to do this. So it's beyond encouragement. Revisit those accommodations, try and try again. So I've been talking a lot about the interactive process. I've hinted a little bit at what it means, but it really means an interactive process. It means a discussion between you, the employer, the staff that needs to know. So sometimes is that the supervisor? Maybe if it's a small business, but it doesn't have to be. It typically can be someone in HR or someone in a higher level management position, because individuals with disabilities don't necessarily need to disclose their disability and their needs to their direct supervisor. That's why it always behooves an employer to have a point person on staff who is the person who is going to handle these reasonable accommodations. Make that known to your staff. Make it a friendly, open door policy so someone can come in and have that conversation with that point person and knowing that their information will be kept confidential, which you're also obligated to do under the law. So the interactive process, it's not just forms and documentations. Being an actual person involved in that conversation is really at the heart of it. And again, I pointed out this earlier, but we want to make sure that you only gather the information that you need as disability verification. You don't want to create a burden on the employee who has the disability. You don't want to ask for more documentation that maybe doesn't have anything to do with the disability, or find out how many doctor's appointments this person has been to, because you're violating their rights. So for some good accommodation examples, I'm going to turn it back to Nasha.
Thanks, Linda. Linda's mentioned some of these. I'm going to give it a little more depth and go into some more detail. And remember that accommodating an individual doesn't start when they start the job. It can start as early as requesting an application, applying for the position, for the interview. So it is throughout the process that the candidate can ask for an accommodation on the onset when they're applying or interviewing, and then when they're employed until essentially retirement. One example is assistive technology. This could be the option of someone having the ability to do like testing that might be required. Most is online, but not all businesses have gone to online testing and things. But to request that things are provided electronically, or that they have a screen reader possibly if there's a vision issue. This could be for employment or anywhere in the process. So whatever that technology is. It could be adjusting or modifying test or training materials. If someone, let's say, is visually impaired and does need something in Braille instead of the traditional book, that could be an accommodation. Acquiring or modifying equipment. Maybe someone needs a screen reader for a computer, or they need speech to text type technology or drag and dictate or something like that. Maybe they need an ergonomic desk, an ergonomic workstation, a better chair than the standard chair that everybody else uses. Maybe their desk may have to be lowered or raised. These could be a modification to that. It could also be something as simple as that person brings their own modification to equipment. Some of the simplest modifications, if you think of someone that works in an office setting, instead of a handheld stapler, the type of stapler that plugs in, or a 3-hole punch that is the one you hold in your hand. Maybe someone has, rheumatoid arthritis, and you have the bigger 3-hole punch with that big handle on the top, which is much easier to navigate than just the dexterity of the hands. So that could be a modification to equipment. It could be modifying a work schedule. When we think of a disability, we think of the actual disability, but what about the medications that treat those disabilities? Maybe someone has a condition where they take medications that make them extremely groggy in the morning, and they can work full time, but maybe they can't get in the building and be ready to go at 8, but at 8:30, they're fine. That could potentially be a modification. And it would be backed up by the fact that this is something that is required for them to be productive. They have to take the medication in order to get to work and to be productive at work. That extra 30 minutes could be the biggest, lifesaver for them, just to have that as a modification. When we think of job restructuring, these are not in any particular order, but I would say when it comes to these last two, this is kind of where you've kind of tried pretty much everything else when you get to these two. Job restructuring could potentially be, let's say someone has a hearing loss. They use a sign language interpreter sometimes, but they are able to speak and they do have residual hearing. So they can hear, but they may communicate more effectively when they have a sign language interpreter. Maybe they work in a setting that is like a call center, or a center where they have information coming in and they have to respond to it. So if you think of live chats versus calling into someone, maybe the position they're in is not set up to be a live chat. Everyone calls in for every other employee in this same unit, but this employee does the live chats, and that is a job restructure. So that employee does live chats to assist customers, where everyone else picks up the phone and talks to customers. So that could potentially be a restructure, and that could look like tons of other things too. Let's say, like Linda said, you've tried pretty much everything you can think of and tested it out and trial and error, and feel like you've exhausted all possibilities. Hopefully you have been keeping track of all this. You have been engaged in the process. Interactive process is not one-sided. It has to be both ways. So if the business is engaged in an interactive process and the employee isn't, or vice versa, it's truly not an interactive process. On the side of the business though, you want to make sure you're documenting all of your efforts and having that in the file. So if anything does go wrong, you can say, no, we did this. We've been working with this employee for over a year. We've tried every single thing, and it's just not want to work out. Reassigning an employee, the goal would be to reassign that employee internally within the organization into a position where they are qualified to do the work. Sometimes that is not an option, and the only other option may be that this is not a good fit for this employee and they have to be terminated. So that reassignment, again, depending on the organization, that should always be a conversation. It's not just, hey, guess what? You're moving over here now. It should be a conversation, but it should be something that you talk about, and it's known that this reassignment is part of an accommodation process, because that could potentially end up being another issue where a person is just like, oh, I got another position at work, but doesn't truly understand that this new position or reassignment was part of the reasonable accommodation process. Next slide, please. When we look at accommodating a diverse workforce, in some of the work we've done in the businesses we've worked with, we've noticed that sometimes some of the things that we consider, thank you, Linda, as an accommodation or something that might assist an individual can be very universal and does not just apply to the individual that has that disability. So on the screen, you'll see a list of functional limitations and strategies. And a functional limitation is essentially anything that causes a person not to be able to do something and they can't do it because of a diagnosis or a disability. But if you look at this list, initiating and sustaining effort and all the rest, you will see that this is actually something that anyone could have. Some people who don't have disabilities and those that do may have functional limitations in these areas. So I'm sure we all know and maybe even work with people that have difficulty working in groups or initiating or planning or organizing or seeing other people's points of view. And if you think of like managing individuals, with the first one, it could just be providing direct feedback. To setting boundaries is a concern, set clear boundaries. Working in groups, allow breaks during, this says class, but allow breaks during even trainings, class, work, assigning roles can be helpful if that's a difficulty. When it is an issue with initiating, planning, or organizing and carrying out tasks, not all employers will, depending on where you work and in the setting, you can't always use a laptop for note taking, but that doesn't mean you can't use other devices. So on a manufacturing floor, often like cell phones aren't utilized, but could a cell phone be used as an accommodation to help someone move on to the next task, like an alarm going off, or a little alarm that says, go to station 4. It just depends. Seeing other points of views. This one is important, especially in meeting situations. You want to kind of avoid just calling on people randomly, which is where agendas come into place, meeting agendas, people taking minutes in meetings so that once a meeting is over, someone can see what was actually said and like the outcome instead of kind of going off of their own assumption of meetings. And another one for this is kind of front loading. We're having this meeting next week, if you have any questions about this topic, send your questions in now instead of those questions coming up the day of the meeting. That cold calling is kind of just like saying, we're in this training right now and I said, hey, Kim, tell me what you think about that. That can be difficult, not only for Kim, who has to respond, but for other people in that meeting who don't necessarily do well when it comes to other people's points of views. Next slide, please. So this one, understanding social rules, avoiding idioms, metaphors, and sarcasm. So that means using very concrete language. If you give an example, know that it is an example of this is what we're doing or this is how it goes, because that can be very difficult for some people to understand. Assessing priorities and performance. This is where those group roles come in, that regular feedback. It doesn't mean you need to talk to someone every single day, but maybe you have a standing 2-time-a-month meeting with someone just to check in, or you can call it a check-in. Asking for assistance and clarification. Everyone doesn't feel comfortable asking for assistance for whatever reason. It might be comprehension. It might be, like an anxiety. Maybe they just don't want to. And I know even for myself, visual learning helps me a lot. If I have a picture with it, a chart, something that'll break information down. Flowcharts are awesome Because sometimes just even in meetings, someone just talking, which I'm doing right now, and I will stop, can be very like, oh my God, it's so much coming in at me. Interpreting vague instructions. This is where those agendas and meeting minutes and kind of follow-up type of things are really good. So this is good also, let's say someone has a hearing loss and you're having a conversation 101, and that person's, okay, I got it, I understand. Maybe follow up later that day, like, hey, just wanted to make sure we're on the same page with our conversation earlier to make sure these 3 things are completed by Thursday. So even if that person didn't want to admit in the moment, in the conversation, like, I have no clue what you're saying right now, they have it in writing and they can follow up. And then again, using concrete information instead of being so abstract. Now we're going to move into some very specific case examples of what some accommodations may look like in a work environment. Angie?
So thank you, Nasha. This is Angie, the occupational therapist, and I'm just going to run through a couple of these case studies. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And I'll ask for a little bit of interaction in the chat if you'd like to participate. So our first case study here, and these are actual referrals that came our way. This individual had a neck strain, low back pain, from a previous injury. She also had a mood disorder with anxiety, and she had been recently hired in an industrial setting where she was inspecting small parts in a shop and operating machinery. So if you could, in the chat, take a minute and think about what type of barriers might she face with neck strain, back pain, and then getting this job with a mood disorder with anxiety and going through the hiring process and a new job, new learning, all of those types of things. So I'll give you a moment there if you're able to access the chat and what type of barriers might she be experiencing. So if you're thinking about along the lines of what type of flooring she's standing on, standing all day, that might be hard on the back, you're on the right track there. Neck strain, if she's constantly looking down or hunched over, that kind of thing, especially if she's looking at small parts. And then with the mood disorder with anxiety, it can be very anxiety provoking or producing for people to go through the hiring process. I mean, who doesn't get nervous starting a new job and having to learn new things? But somebody who might have additional anxiety can experience additional symptoms. So again, neck pain when looking down, these were the barriers. Back pain exacerbated by prolonged standing on that concrete surface in the shop, anxiety with new learning, and she self-reported some memory issues. So what types of things might we put in place to help somebody like this? So we looked at bringing her workstation up to her, more to eye level, so she didn't have to constantly flex her neck to look down, anti-fatigue matting to cushion her feet under her, but also reduce that compression on the discs of the back. And then she also had a notebook to write down steps, which was perfectly fine with her employer, so she could keep track of how to operate the different machinery. The employer felt that they had a trainer who was patient and thorough and encouraged her to ask questions. And she also just got some reassurance from the business. They ended up saying, you know, she's one of our best employees. She's always on time. She's always here. And they did not feel like she was experiencing any type of memory issue out of the ordinary. So a lot of that was some of her own anxiety brought on by her condition. So that reassurance really helped her quite a bit. And then we also talked about her getting a vision exam to update her glasses so she can see those small parts better. And then continuing to work on self-advocacy and continue counseling for some self-soothing strategies for the anxiety. Let's look at case study number 2 here. So this is more ergonomics in an office setting and something called universal design. So a lot of times when we end up implementing accommodations, oftentimes they work for not only that individual, but many people in a setting can benefit from them. And that's when you get something called universal design. Think of automatic door openers, that can help somebody not only with a disability or who utilizes a wheelchair for mobility, but somebody injured who is using crutches, perhaps somebody carrying packages or pushing a stroller. Also curb cuts, those are great examples on the sidewalk of universal design that help everybody to navigate, the sidewalks better. So back to our case study number 2, we have an office worker with severe chronic pain who had been really in the same seated position at the same desk for about 10 years. And a typical desk doesn't always work for everybody when we have different statures, different heights and body types. And so this individual noticed that when they went to physical therapy, they were experiencing symptom relief, but when they returned to that office setting, that same old pain was coming back. And then we have another employee, a similar situation. So they had experienced a non-work related back injury, and they were using their own workstation with accommodations, but they were also required to use a communal workstation several days out of the week, which of course was not customized to their specific needs. So again, they were experiencing relief at their customized personal workstation, but then continuing to have pain and discomfort and postural fatigue at the communal workstation. So some ideas of what we could put in place to help these individuals, but also kind of looking at that universal design. What will work for these communal workstations? And what we found was some of this ergonomic equipment that you see pictured here was very helpful. So that included a sit to stand workstation to adjust the height of the desk to whomever is using it, laptop riser that brings the laptop screen up to eye level, and then an anti-fatigue mat, again, for standing on. You don't want to stand too long on a hard surface that can be really hard on the back. We looked at a footrest. These are really kind of simple fixes. Footrest can be under $20, ergonomic keyboard. And then for the second employee, we provided the same kind of options for a universal workstation. And the rationale was this will help all of your employees who use this workstation. So at this point, anybody, do you have any questions that we haven't gotten to? You can put them in the chat or you could unmute and go ahead and ask away.
And actually what we kind of like to do at this time is if someone out there, you guys have been less chatty in the chat, but if you have a situation going on in your current workplace or you'd like us to do a live case study at this point, we have enough time to do that. So if you want to put in the chat a disability and maybe an occupation together, we can kind of go through that and show you what that looks like.
And while you're thinking of something to put in there, I put in the chat, how much do you think the average accommodations may cost your organization? And you can put some money amounts in there or just say them out loud. Any ideas?
So Sue is saying $100. So you guys totally have us as a captive resource for you right now. So feel free to ask us any question. And again, we'd love to strategize with you guys to give you some more information and some more resources so you can work through the actual situations that you guys have at your places of work.
Now I know Mona, and Mona, do you have any examples of anything you've encountered when you're working with businesses that has come up as concerns?
I know a couple of companies that we've talked to with concerns. They were kind of concerned about like overstepping or they're just hesitant about too many requests upon them for accommodations, or not being able to accommodate, and then the person still not being able to do the work. So I know a lot of companies are just hesitant about stepping into people that would need some type of accommodation, because I think they're just nervous about them.
So I guess my question would be, are they just not accommodating, or?
I think it's they don't know how to accommodate, and they're not sure how to accommodate, and they're really and some of them, they're just uncertain because they don't feel that their jobs can be accommodated for to do the work that is needed from the employee. And I also know that there's some concern with that the job seeker doesn't disclose that they might need an accommodation, and companies are nervous about, now that we hired this person, what do we do?
So let's ask two things. We'll start with Linda's got it. Oh, she's got the question in the chat. I'll speak to yours. So with the first part of this, that's it, and this is just Nasha speaking, not Nasha from MRS. How do I know something won't work if I don't know what I'm looking for, or if I don't know what to try? So that is why it is good to be connected with like you, who is connected with us, to say, hey, I know this can be difficult, but our role in working with businesses is you don't have to take all those on. Like, you don't have to be in HR and an expert in disability. There are resources for that. So you can, consultation with us to help provide some of those, maybe potentially never thought about options for an individual with a disability can always be done. And I mean, that's a lot of weight for someone to be in HR, whether they're a large business or small, or maybe there is no HR department and this is the owner that is doing it, or, the office manager, like that. There are resources to assist with trying to have those conversations and to meet the needs of that employee and meet the needs of the business. So that would kind of be my blanket response for the first part. The second part of that, though, is if someone does request an accommodation, by law, either 1 to 14 or 15 and above, there needs to be a conversation and an interactive process. So it is better to have those conversations and try or attempt to figure it out or negotiate that or implement something than to not, because no business wants to get sued. If someone's like, oh, this person asked for something and yeah, I just don't think we can do it, that is an easy lawsuit. So, these are legal obligations that an organization has to still adhere to. And if the EEOC comes in, the rationale of we didn't know what to do, unfortunately, won't work. So knowing what the resources that are available and whether it's working with us or some other resource, but you have to start by having a conversation. And if an organization is not comfortable with that, we do trainings like this and tons of other trainings about disability awareness. Because if a manager is not comfortable speaking to their employees about disability or accommodations, or that employee is not comfortable speaking to their HR team or a direct manager about their need for an accommodation or their disability, there definitely needs to be some disability awareness that'll help shift that. So disability isn't seen as, the elephant in the corner, the elephant in the room. It is a word, disability. Every single one of us, whether we say we have a disability or not, have some things that we do different and things that cause us to have limitations in our activities, whether that's an old sports injury or something from a car accident, or, I'm getting older and I'm still working and now my medical file is getting thicker. 1 in 5 people have a disability. Doesn't mean they say they have a disability, but they have a disability per the legal definition of the ADA, meaning they can request reasonable accommodations. So to those businesses, to have just a very transparent conversation. Oh, I'm sorry. And the stat now is one out of every 4 people have a disability. So the stats have actually increased. To have those conversations, which can be difficult for some businesses, that really is the start of changing that culture. Because if people don't even want to talk about it, it's bigger than just a person with a disability. It's probably a company culture that kind of needs to be addressed, because whether they have someone now or get someone in 6 months or 6 years, people are working longer. Unfortunately, we don't know what the long-term effects of COVID-19 may be, as people are still working or re-entering the workforce. So these are really conversations that organizations need to be comfortable with having and know legally what they're obligated to do or not do. But it really speaks to changing a culture and being okay with talking to someone. Interactive process is just communication. And I think Linda's going to go to the next one.
Yeah, and before I do, I'm going to touch on, just reinforce something, because what I'm also hearing Mona say is, in the work that she does, interacting with businesses, and given what you just said, Nasha, regarding the legal aspect of that, people being litigious, is that some businesses may be fearful in hiring individuals with disabilities. But given the statistics that we do have, if you have 5 or more people in your workforce, we know statistically speaking that you already have someone in your workforce that has a disability. Will they need an accommodation? Maybe, maybe not, because not every person with a disability needs an accommodation. But if you, as someone who are in a position of power in business, is being exclusive and not trying to hire individuals with disabilities, let's step away from the fact that that is against the law and is discriminatory, but you're doing a disservice by not actually rounding out the employees that you have with diversity and the value that diversity can bring to your workforce. We see this in all other protected classes as well. So getting kind of in front of that and doing the things that Nasha mentioned, having those open conversations, and that really bleeds into that question that came in the chat actually from Mona, and how to get employees to speak up, to disclose about an issue they have. And Sue provided a really great answer. So we appreciate this kind of dialogue. She said the best way to engage employees is to share struggles, to make a broadcast to the entire team, announcing the desire to meet the needs of each team member to ensure optimal performance of each person. Then offer a means of a more private connection to the correct person to help accommodate the request. Absolutely. And one of the best ways to do that is a culture change, company culture change, which we see being most effective when it's supported from the top down. Have that open culture in your workplace. Encourage people that you want all of them, every part of who they are, you want that person in the place of work. And now, if you're a business who's seeking talent, know that millennials make up the largest generation in the workforce. And by 2025, they will make up 75% of the global workforce. And we hear this time and time again. Millennials are not just committed to having a job. They want to work for a company that embraces social causes. Not that hiring people with disabilities is necessarily a social cause, but embracing every aspect of your employee inside your work environment is exactly what they are talking about, regardless of what difference that is. Telling them that you value who they are and what they bring to the table will not only make that person an employee for the moment, it will make them a career employee. It will also bring to you the value, again, that diversity brings. So I completely concur with what Sue said, and you just have to have a more open environment to encourage people to disclose. How do you have that open environment? You include it in everything you do. You have staff meetings that talk about how inclusive you are, how welcoming you are, how you invite employees to come talk to whomever the identified person or persons is regarding struggles that they have, how they can make work better. You want to be there. You want to support your employees. Each one of us that is on this call works for someone, unless we are a private business owner, and we probably have worked for someone before this time. We can think about companies we worked for that have been supportive and those that have not been supportive. Which one would you rather work for? You yourself? It's the same answer for every employee that works for you or under you. Are there any other questions that we can answer? I know we're kind of coming to a close here, but I just want to make sure that we still invite you guys to ask us questions. In a moment, I'll advance the slides and share to you our information. Nasha will be your primary point of contact. You can reach out to us at any time if maybe you have a question that you haven't felt comfortable sharing here, or a question comes up tomorrow or 30 days from today. Please reach out to us. We are an absolutely free service in the community. We work for the state, and really, as cliche as it sounds, we are here to help.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was so interesting. Like, there was a lot of great information, and I think that putting that out on our social media, it's going to get a lot more views, and you'll probably get some interesting emails and follow up from that.
We appreciate you having us here to just discuss this. We thought it was fitting because this is the commemorative year of the ADA, the 30th anniversary, and I thought it'd be good info to share with your membership. Because we're always trying to improve in what we do, there is a survey in the chat that we're requesting. If you could you can click right into it now. It'll take you right there, and just literally take maybe a minute just to complete that for us. If there's any questions, any comments, any follow-up, our contact information is here. I cover Oakland County, and I work with Mona. So that's why I was like, I know Mona. I would be the primary contact. But if it's something related to, occupational therapy, then, we can bring Angela in. Or maybe you have a business that's also covering another county like Macomb, then we'll collaborate with you. But please take our info. If anything comes up where you need additional info, feel free to reach out. And we just really appreciate you taking the time today. We have the next slide just gives you a little info about how to reach us online. And we also have, it includes information for services for individual job seekers, as well as information for business services from organizations or businesses in the community that may need additional support or help.
Great. Thank you again, everybody. We appreciate all your information and your time today. And thank you for those of you that were joining us today. We appreciate your participation. So everybody have a great day, and we will see you again soon with our next seminar series.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.